The meeting happened in a service corridor 14 meters below the Asthari Conclave's formal hearing chamber, in a maintenance alcove that smelled of recycled coolant and ozone. Marin Aldrich had chosen it because the Conclave's internal surveillance grid did not extend to infrastructure tunnels rated for sanitation drones, and because the only being who knew she was there had risked a career to tell her the one thing that could save Envoy Dossett's life. "They've already written the sentence," said Prefect Lorethku. He stood against the curved wall, his long gray fingers interlaced at his sternum, his wide-set amber eyes catching the dim utility light in a way that made them look like polished glass. Asthari were tall, narrow-shouldered, with skin the color of wet slate and cranial ridges that fanned out from the bridge of the nose like the spines of a closed book. Lorethku was a mid-ranking procedural officer in the Conclave's judicial secretariat. He had served for 31 years. He had never spoken to a human before tonight. "The sentence was drafted before the trial began," he said, "before the charges were formalized, before Envoy Dossett was even arrested." Marin did not move. She stood with her back to a bundle of coolant pipes, her arms at her sides, her expression the same controlled blank she had worn through 11 days of hearings. She was 46 years old, short brown hair going gray at the temples, lean frame inside a dark-fitted jacket that carried no insignia, no decoration, no rank. She was a civilian defense attorney, the Terran Confederacy's senior legal advocate for interstellar proceedings, and she had traveled 14 weeks through relay space to stand in a hearing chamber where the outcome had apparently been sealed before she arrived. "Who drafted it?" she said. "Not a question, a directive." "Archon Savith Nal, personally." Marin absorbed that. Archon Savith Nal was the presiding jurist of the Conclave's Supreme Bench, the highest judicial authority in the Asthari sovereignty, a body that governed 411 inhabited systems and had existed for over 2,000 years. Savith Nal had opened the trial. Savith Nal had sustained every prosecution motion. Savith Nal had denied every defense motion Marin had filed, 31 of them, each denied on procedural grounds so narrow they bordered on fabrication. And Savith Nal had written the death sentence before the trial started. "How do you know this?" Marin asked. "Because I formatted the document." Lorethku's voice was flat and dry, the way Asthari voices got when they were suppressing something their culture did not permit them to express openly. "The Judicial Secretariat prepares all sentencing documents. Standard procedure is to draft templates after the evidentiary phase concludes and forward them to the presiding jurist for selection. I was assigned to draft the templates for proceeding 7714T. And there were no templates. The Archon's office sent a single completed document to the Secretariat on the morning of the trial's first day and instructed me to hold it in the restricted queue until the verdict phase. The document was already signed." Marin looked at the data chip Lorethku was holding between two fingers, pinched delicately as if it might ignite. "The timestamp is embedded in the file metadata," he said. "The signature hash is authentic. It cannot be altered without detection." "Why are you showing me this?" The Asthari was quiet for a moment. His cranial ridges shifted, a micro-expression Marin had learned to read over 11 days of watching Asthari faces. It meant discomfort shading toward something more dangerous, conviction. "Because Envoy Dossett committed no crime," Lorethku said. "The charges against him are a construction. The evidence was curated, and in 31 years I have never been asked to file a completed sentence before a trial has heard its first witness." He held out the chip. Marin took it. She studied it in her palm for 3 seconds. The chip was warm body heat from Lorethku's fingers, transferred through the casing. It was a small thing, a data chip the size of her thumbnail, holding a document that proved the highest judicial authority in 411 star systems had decided to kill a man before hearing his case. She had traveled 14 weeks through relay space. She had filed 31 motions. She had sat through 11 days of predetermined theater. And now, a mid-ranking bureaucrat in a maintenance corridor had given her the one thing that the Conclave's entire legal machinery had been designed to keep hidden. She slipped the chip into the inner pocket of her jacket. "The session reconvenes at second bell tomorrow," she said. "The defense is scheduled to present closing arguments. The Archon will not permit new evidence during closings. Procedural Rule 41 prohibits." "I know what Rule 41 prohibits, Prefect." Lorethku looked at her. His amber eyes held something that Marin had seen before, on other faces, in other chambers, across other species. It was the look of someone who had done the hardest part, and now had to trust that the person they had handed the weight to could carry it. "Prefect," Marin said, "go back to your office, file nothing, tell no one. Whatever happens tomorrow, your name will not appear in any motion, any filing, or any record I produce. You have my word." He inclined his head, the Asthari gesture that meant assent, or possibly resignation, and walked back down the corridor without another word. Marin stood in the maintenance alcove for 2 full minutes after he left. She pressed her thumb against the data chip through the fabric of her jacket and breathed. Then she climbed the 14 meters of service ladder back to the surface level, crossed the Judicial District's lamplit plaza under the pale glow of the station's artificial sky, and entered the detention wing where envoy Tobias Dossett had been held for 37 days. The guards at the wing's entrance processed her credentials with the same rigid courtesy they had shown every visit. But tonight something was different. A tension in the way, the senior guard's cranial ridges drew together when he scanned her advocate's pass, as if the bureaucratic machinery of the Conclave was beginning to sense tremors it could not yet name. He waved her through without the secondary verification he had insisted upon for the past week. Small shifts. The kind that only someone who had spent 11 days mapping institutional body language would notice. The detention cell was clean, sparse, and well lit. The Asthari did not believe in punitive conditions prior to sentencing, which was one of the few elements of their legal system that Marin had found civilized. Dossett was sitting on the edge of his cot, reading something on a lone data slate. He was 61, white-haired, heavyset, with the kind of face that suggested a life spent in rooms where nobody raised their voice, but everyone was armed with words. He had been the Terran Confederacy's senior diplomatic envoy to the Asthari Conclave for 9 years. He had negotiated 3 trade agreements, mediated 2 border disputes, and built a network of institutional relationships that had taken nearly a decade to cultivate. He had been arrested 42 days ago on charges of espionage, subversion of Conclave sovereignty, and unlawful transmission of classified Asthari defense intelligence to a foreign power. Every charge was fabricated. Marin knew this because she had spent 11 days in the hearing chamber watching the prosecution's evidence disintegrate under even cursory examination. The classified intelligence Dossett had allegedly transmitted was a navigational chart of the Rishan border region, a chart that had been publicly available in the Conclave's own trade registry for 6 years. The foreign power he had allegedly transmitted it to was the Terran Confederacy itself, his own government, to which he reported openly as a registered diplomatic envoy. The subversion charge rested on a series of private meetings Dossett had held with minor trade officials, meetings that were documented, reported to the Conclave's protocol office, and conducted in accordance with every applicable regulation. None of it mattered. The prosecution presented the evidence with the solemn weight of a body that knew the verdict was already written. The 3-judge panel, 2 associate jurists flanking Archon Savith Nal at the center, listened with the attentive stillness of officials whose role was ceremonial. The gallery, filled with Asthari diplomatic staff, and a handful of alien observers from allied states, watched with the detached interest of an audience at a performance whose ending was not in doubt. And Marin had filed motion after motion, 31 in total, each one constructed with precision, citing specific provisions of the Conclave's own judicial code. And every one had been denied, not on the merits, on scope, on timing, on standing, on procedural grounds so narrow that any competent jurist would have recognized them as pretexts. Motion 7 had requested access to the original classification records for the intelligence documents at the heart of the espionage charge. Denied, the records were internal to the Security Directorate and outside the scope of defense discovery. Motion 12 had requested that Deputy Trade Minister Carath be subpoenaed as a witness. Denied, the named individual is currently stationed outside tribunal jurisdiction, and the Conclave's subpoena authority does not extend to remote postings. Motion 19 had requested an independent forensic audit of the classification timestamps. Denied, the defense has not established sufficient grounds to question the archival integrity of the Conclave's own records. Each denial was technically defensible in isolation. Together, they formed a wall, and behind that wall, Marin was now certain, sat a pre-signed death sentence. The most revealing moment had come on day 8, when Marin had requested permission to cross-examine the Security Directorate's lead analyst, the officer who had prepared the classification report used to support the espionage charge. Savith Nall had granted the request, which had briefly surprised Marin until she understood why. The analyst was a professional. He had delivered his testimony with crisp precision, citing document numbers and classification protocols from memory. But when Marin asked him to confirm the date on which the classification of the trade corridor projections had been determined, he had hesitated. Not long, perhaps 2 seconds, but it was the only hesitation any prosecution witness had shown in 11 days. And when he answered, he gave the date of the original classification, the internal distribution date, not the backdated, restricted intelligence date that appeared in the prosecution's evidence file. Marin had asked him to repeat the date. He did. It did not match the prosecution's records. Torek Shal had objected immediately, and Savith Nall had sustained the objection and struck the exchange from the record, ruling that the witness had been asked to testify on classification protocol, not on specific dates, and that the defense was exceeding the scope of the permitted cross-examination. The date had been struck from the record, but Marin had heard it, and she had written it down. But the 2 associate jurists never objected to the Archon's rulings, and the gallery never questioned them, and the proceeding rolled forward with the mechanical inevitability of a process designed to reach a predetermined end. "You look like someone handed you a grenade," Dossett said when she entered the cell. Marin sat down on the bench opposite him. "I need to ask you something, and I need the truth, not the diplomatic version." "I've been giving you the truth for 11 days. "I know this is a different question," she leaned forward. "When you were arrested, the Conclave Security Directorate seized your personal files, your correspondence, your meeting logs. Everything on your diplomatic terminal." "Yes." "Was there anything in those files, anything at all, that a hostile party could use to construct a credible espionage charge? Not a real one, a constructed one. Something that, if taken out of context and presented selectively, could be made to look like unauthorized intelligence activity." Dossett set the data slate down. He looked at her for a long moment, and his expression shifted from weary patience to something sharper. "You found something. Answer the question." He exhaled through his nose. "My correspondence with Deputy Trade Minister Ashiv Carath. We exchanged 47 messages over a period of 3 years regarding the Rishan border trade corridor. The messages discussed projected traffic volumes, tariff structures, capacity assessments, all of it related to the trade agreement I was negotiating on behalf of the Confederacy. And And some of those messages referenced Conclave internal projections that hadn't been published yet. Karath shared them with me informally because he wanted the trade agreement to succeed. He believed the Confederacy's participation would stabilize the corridor. He was right. The projections showed a 30% increase in trade volume within 2 years of Confederacy access. The agreement would have benefited every member state in the conclave. Were those projections classified? They were marked internal distribution at the time, not classified. Internal distribution means they were available to any conclave official above a certain clearance grade. Karath had that clearance. He shared them at his discretion, as the provision allowed. And after your arrest? Dossett's jaw tightened. After my arrest, the Security Directorate reclassified those projections as restricted intelligence. Retroactively, they changed the classification stamps in the conclave's own records and backdated the change to make it appear that the projections had always been restricted. Marin sat back. That's the construction. That's the construction. And the worst part is that Karath knows it. He was the one who shared the material. He knows the original classification, but he hasn't spoken, not a word since my arrest. Pressured. Reassigned. They moved him to a border station 2 days after I was taken into custody. Monitoring station Verath 9, 3 relay jumps from the nearest tribunal jurisdiction. He can't testify even if he wanted to. The transit time alone would take longer than the trial. Another piece. Another deliberate removal of anything that might complicate the narrative. Tobias, tomorrow is closing arguments. After that, the panel delivers its verdict. Based on what I've seen in this hearing chamber, the verdict is going to be guilty on all counts. I know. The sentence for espionage under conclave law is death, not symbolic, not exile, not imprisonment. Death by neural cessation. I know that too. His voice was level, but his hands, folded in his lap, had tightened enough to press white half-moons into his knuckles. 9 years. 9 years of building something real between two civilizations, and it would end with an electrode behind his ear. Tobias, I need you to understand something else. If the verdict goes through and the sentence is carried out, the Confederacy will respond. Not with diplomacy. The relationship with the conclave will end. Every trade agreement, every transit protocol, every intelligence-sharing arrangement, all of it. The Confederacy does not let its diplomats be executed on fabricated charges and then negotiate over the body. Dossett looked at her steadily. I know what happens if I die here, counselor. I've known since the day they arrested me. That's why I didn't fight the arrest. That's why I've cooperated with every procedural step, every hearing, every session. Because if the Confederacy's response is going to carry weight, the record has to show that their envoy conducted himself with full respect for the conclave's process, even when the process was a theater. The discipline in that statement was so complete, so carefully considered, that Marin felt the weight of it settle in her chest. He had been thinking about his own death not as a personal event but as a diplomatic variable. He had been cooperating not out of hope but out of institutional duty, making sure that, when the Confederacy pointed to his case, the record would show a man who had given the conclave every opportunity to do the right thing. I have something that changes the geometry of this proceeding, but to use it, I need to do something that the conclave's rules explicitly prohibit during closing arguments. I need to introduce new evidence. Dossett looked at her steadily. What evidence? I can't tell you. Not because I don't trust you, because if you know, and they question you under oath about what your counsel disclosed, the answer could be used to disqualify the evidence before I get it on the record. Dossett studied her face. 9 years of diplomacy had taught him to read the weight of what people were not saying. How bad is it? He asked. Bad enough that a 31-year career bureaucrat risked everything to put it in my hand. Dossett nodded once. He picked up the data slate and set it on the bench beside him, then folded his hands in his lap. "Do what you need to do, counselor." Marin stood. She looked at him for a moment, this man who had spent 9 years building relationships in a sovereignty that was now preparing to execute him for the crime of having built them too well. She thought about the trade agreement he had been negotiating, the one that would have opened the Rishan corridor, stabilized 3 border economies, and given the Conclave's smaller member states access to Confederacy supply lines. Someone had decided that agreement could not be allowed to succeed. Someone had decided that the relationships Dossett had built were a threat, not an asset. And rather than cancel the negotiations through diplomatic channels, they had built a cage of fabricated evidence around the man himself. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow is going to be long." She left the detention wing and walked back to the quarters the Conclave had assigned her, a small, functional apartment in the diplomatic residential block, with a narrow window that looked out onto the Conclave's central atrium. Through the window, the great glass dome of the hearing chamber was visible against the artificial sky, lit from within by the pale amber glow of the judicial systems that never shut down. Marin sat at the desk. Through the narrow window, the Conclave's central atrium was quiet. The broad plazas and covered walkways that connected the judicial district's buildings were lit by the station's night cycle lighting, warm amber reduced to a dim gold that cast long shadows between the stone columns. Somewhere in this station, Archon Savith Nall was preparing for what she believed would be the final session of a predetermined trial. Somewhere, Torek Shal was polishing his closing argument, adding the final rhetorical touches to a narrative he would deliver with conviction and skill. Somewhere, the guards in the detention wing were logging their shift rotation, unaware that the man they were holding would either walk free tomorrow or be executed within 48 hours, depending on what happened in the next 10 hours. Marin pulled up the Conclave's judicial code on her own secure terminal, not the Conclave-issued one, which she had stopped trusting on day 3 of the trial when she noticed the file access logs showed queries she had not made. She scrolled through the provisions until she found provision 12. She read it 3 times, cross-referencing every clause with the precedent archive she had compiled during the 14-week transit to the Conclave. Then she opened the data chip's contents on a quarantine partition and verified what Loreth Ku had told her. The timestamp was there. The signature hash was authentic. The sentencing document was real, complete with the specific method of execution, the designated facility, and the disposal protocol for the remains. Someone had written all of that before the trial's first morning session. Someone had decided how a man would die before hearing a word in his defense. She drafted her challenge brief in 2 hours. She rehearsed the oral presentation in 1. She ran through every possible objection the bench could raise and prepared her response to each 16 scenarios, each with a primary and secondary counter. She checked the Confederacy's relay station transit logs, still intact, still showing the original classification headers on every piece of correspondence between Dossett and Karath. The logs were stored on Confederacy systems, beyond the Conclave's reach. That was the seam. That was what the construction had failed to account for. She also pulled the procedural records from the trial's first 10 days, every motion she had filed, every ruling Savith Nall had issued, every stated reason for denial. She arranged them chronologically and read them in sequence. The pattern was there, visible only in aggregate. The denials were not random. They were progressive. Each one closed a slightly different avenue of inquiry, and together they formed a corridor, narrowing, directing, funneling the defense toward a single permissible conclusion: that the evidence was valid, the charges were sound, and the verdict was inevitable. Savith Nall had not merely presided over a predetermined trial. She had designed it like an engineer designs a drainage system, every channel calculated to ensure the water flowed in one direction. Marin saved the chronological analysis to her secure terminal. She would not need it tomorrow. The pre-signed sentence was a heavier weapon than procedural pattern analysis. But she kept the file, because if the oversight committee was honest, they would want to see how far back the architecture of this particular injustice extended. At 4 hours before second bell she slept, not well but enough. She woke to a message on her secure terminal routed through the Confederacy's diplomatic relay, encrypted from the office of the Terran Confederacy's Secretary of Interstellar Affairs. It was 3 sentences long. "We are aware of the proceeding's status. We have confidence in your judgment. Act as you see fit. No instructions, no constraints, no suggestions." Just the weight of a government that had sent her across 14 weeks of relay space, and was now standing back to let her do the work she had come to do. She dressed, collected her data slate, and walked to the hearing chamber. The corridor that connected the diplomatic residential block to the judicial district was 200 meters of polished stone and recessed lighting, a neutral space designed for the orderly transit of officials between work and rest. At this hour, it was nearly empty. The few Asthari she passed, early rising clerks and security officers beginning their shifts, gave her the formal nods of recognition that protocol demanded when encountering a credentialed foreign advocate. None of them spoke. None of them slowed their pace. None of them had any reason to suspect that the woman walking past them in a dark jacket, with no insignia, was carrying a data chip that would, within the hour, dismantle the career of the most powerful jurist in their civilization. Marin had spent 22 years in interstellar law. She had defended Confederacy citizens in 7 different sovereignties, under 7 different judicial systems, against charges ranging from trade violations to territorial incursion. She had won cases she should have lost and lost cases she should have won, and she had learned that the outcome of a legal proceeding was determined less by the strength of the evidence than by the willingness of the adjudicating body to look at it. This was the case that would test that principle to its limit. The hearing chamber was full when Marin arrived at second bell. The Asthari Conclave's Supreme Judicial Chamber was an immense space, a tiered amphitheater of dark stone and brushed metal that seated 300 observers in curved ascending rows. At the chamber's base, the judicial bench occupied a raised crescent of polished obsidian, behind which the 3-judge panel sat in high-backed chairs carved from a single piece of petrified wood. Holographic displays lined the curved walls, currently showing the case docket in flowing Asthari script. Above it all, the glass dome let in the station's calibrated daylight, warm, even, designed to illuminate the proceedings with the dispassionate clarity the Conclave's founders had considered essential to justice. Archon Savith Nal occupied the center chair. She was ancient even by Asthari standards, tall, gaunt, her slate-gray skin pulled tight over sharp facial ridges, her eyes the color of tarnished copper. She wore the layered judicial vestments of the Supreme Bench, dark crimson over slate gray, with the Conclave seal embroidered at the collar in silver thread. Her hands rested on the bench surface, long fingers interlaced, perfectly still. The 2 associate jurists flanked her, Jurist Devan Orath on the left, younger, with the nervous precision of someone aware of being watched, and Jurist Kelam Vas on the right, older, heavier, with the settled posture of a career functionary who had long ago stopped forming independent opinions. The prosecution's advocate, a lean, sharp-featured Asthari named Torek Shao, sat at the prosecution table with 3 assistants and a wall of data screens. He had presented the Conclave's case with surgical efficiency over 11 days, and he had done it well. Every piece of fabricated evidence had been delivered with the measured gravity of authentic material. Every objection Marin had raised had been met with a procedural counter. Every motion she had filed had been denied, not by Torek Shao, but by Archon Savith Nal, who controlled the tempo of the proceedings the way a conductor controls an orchestra, each ruling timed, each denial calibrated to maintain the appearance of judicial consideration, while ensuring no substantive challenge could gain traction. Marin took her place at the defense table, Envoy Dossett sat beside her, brought from detention in the same dark suit he had worn every day of the trial. He looked calm. He was good at looking calm. 9 years of diplomatic service in a sovereignty that read composure as strength had trained that into him, the way combat trained reflexes into soldiers. Archon Saveth Nall struck the bench chime, a single clear tone that silenced the gallery. Proceeding 7714T reconvenes for closing arguments. The prosecution will present first. Torek Shal stood. His closing argument lasted 40 minutes. It was precise, well-structured, and built on a foundation of evidence that Marin knew was fabricated. He reviewed the reclassified intelligence documents. He reviewed the correspondence between Dossett and Deputy Trade Minister Carath. He presented the narrative the prosecution had constructed, a human envoy who had exploited diplomatic access to extract restricted conclave intelligence and transmit it to a foreign government. He reviewed the private meetings that formed the basis of the subversion charge, meetings that the prosecution framed as clandestine intelligence operations, and that Marin knew were standard diplomatic consultations, documented and reported through proper channels. He presented communication intercepts that showed Dossett coordinating with the Confederacy's trade office, intercepts that proved nothing more than a diplomat doing his job, but that sounded damning when read aloud in a chamber full of people who had already decided what they meant. He closed with a passage that was clearly written for the historical record, a measured condemnation of diplomatic betrayal, an invocation of the Conclave's sacred trust, a reminder that espionage carried consequences that were not negotiable. His voice never rose. His delivery was flawless. 300 observers watched a man build a wall, brick by brick, on a foundation he had never examined because examining it was not his function. Marin watched Dossett throughout the prosecution's closing. He sat with his hands flat on the defense table, his expression neutral, his breathing steady. He did not flinch when Shal described his correspondence as systematic intelligence extraction. He did not react when Shal characterized his trade negotiations as a cover for espionage. He listened to a stranger narrate a version of his 9-year career that bore no resemblance to the career he had actually lived, and he sat through it with the composure of a man who had decided months ago that his conduct in this chamber mattered more than the chamber's verdict. When Shal finished, the gallery was still. The panel's faces were unreadable. Archon Saveth Nall turned to Marin. The defense may present its closing argument. Marin stood. She walked to the speaker's podium at the center of the chamber, a circle of dark stone inlaid with the conclave seal in silver, and set her data slate on the surface. The walk was 12 paces. She had counted them on the first day. 12 paces from the defense table to the podium, across a floor of polished obsidian that reflected the daylight from the dome above in a pale wash. 12 paces that every defense advocate in the history of this chamber had taken before delivering their argument. The last time anyone had walked those 12 paces and done something other than argue within the proceedings' established framework had been 73 years ago. She looked up at the panel, at Saveth Nall's tarnished copper eyes, at the 2 associate jurists who flanked her, at the 300 observers in the gallery who had come to watch the formality of a proceeding, whose result was already sealed in a restricted file 14 meters below the floor they sat on. Archon, distinguished jurists, I will not be delivering a closing argument. A murmur moved through the gallery. Torek Shal's head turned sharply. Instead, Marin said, I am invoking Conclave Judicial Provision 12, the defense advocate's right to challenge the integrity of the proceeding itself. Silence. Archon Saveth Nall's interlaced fingers tightened. The motion was small, a compression of millimeters, but Marin had spent 11 days cataloging this woman's tells and she saw it. Provision 12 has not been invoked in this chamber in 73 years, Counselor Aldrich. Then the chamber is overdue. You understand that a Provision 12 challenge requires documentary evidence of judicial misconduct. Assertion alone is insufficient. I do. And you understand that if your challenge fails to meet the evidentiary threshold, you will be held in contempt, and the proceeding will conclude immediately. I understand. Savith Nal's copper eyes held Marin's for a long beat. The gallery was motionless. Torek Shal had risen to his feet but had not spoken, watching, calculating, his lean face tight with the uncertainty of an advocate who had just realized the proceeding might contain a dimension his briefing had not covered. Present your challenge, the Archon said. Marin touched her data slate. The chamber's holographic display, the curved wall of pale light behind the judicial bench, flickered and resolved into a document. This is the sentencing order for Proceeding 7714T, Marin said. It finds Envoy Tobias Dossett guilty on all 3 counts: espionage, subversion of sovereignty, and unlawful transmission. It orders execution by neural cessation within 48 hours of the verdict. It specifies the facility, the method, and the disposal protocol. The gallery shifted. Several observers leaned forward. This was not unusual. Sentencing orders were standard documents. What was unusual was that Marin was displaying it before the verdict had been delivered. The document bears the signature of Archon Savith Nal, Marin continued. The signature hash has been authenticated by independent verification. The document is genuine. She paused. Let the room sit with it for exactly 3 seconds. The document's metadata timestamp shows that it was created, signed, and filed in the Judicial Secretariat's restricted queue at 6 minutes past first bell on the morning of this trial's opening day. 11 days ago, before the first witness was called, before the first piece of evidence was presented, before I had spoken a single word in this chamber. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room processing information. It was the silence of a room whose floor had been removed. Marin could feel it, the mass of 300 observers recalculating not the content of the trial, but the nature of it. Every session they had watched, every witness they had heard, every motion that had been denied, all of it reframed in a single instant by a timestamp. In the gallery's 3rd row, the Thessari trade envoy, a broad, dark-eyed figure in a formal observer's mantle, had gone rigid. His hands gripped the armrests of his seat. Beside him, the Kethani military observer was making rapid notes on a personal device, her narrow face sharp with the focus of someone who had just been handed intelligence her government would need within the hour. Archon Savith Nal did not move. Her hands remained interlaced on the bench. Her expression held. But the 2 associate jurists, Divan Orath and Kelam Vas, were staring at the document on the display with the rigid focus of individuals who had just realized they were sitting in the frame of a photograph that would define their careers. Counselor Aldrich, Savith Nal said, her voice was perfectly controlled. The provenance of this document is authenticated, Marin said. The signature hash matches your verified judicial key. The metadata timestamp is embedded in the file's creation log, which is maintained by the Conclave's own archival system and cannot be modified without generating a discrepancy flag. No discrepancy flag exists. The document is exactly what it appears to be, a guilty verdict and death sentence, signed by the presiding jurist of this proceeding before the proceeding began. Torek Shal was on his feet. Archon, I object to the introduction of. Sit down, Advocate Shal. Savith Nal's voice cut through the chamber like a blade laid flat on glass. Shal sat, but his expression, the first crack Marin had seen in 11 days of polished prosecution, said that the advocate was running his own calculations now, and the numbers were not coming out in anyone's favor. Marin did not look at the prosecution table. She kept her eyes on the gallery. I have a second document, she said. She touched the data slate again. A new file appeared on the display beside the pre-signed sentence. This is the original classification record for the navigational projections that form the basis of the espionage charge against Envoy Dossett. These projections were exchanged between Envoy Dossett and Deputy Trade Minister Ashiv Karath as part of ongoing trade negotiations. At the time of exchange, these projections were classified as internal distribution, a designation that permits sharing with registered diplomatic counterparts at the discretion of the conclave official holding the material. She let the classification stamp fill the display, clear, unambiguous, dated 3 years prior. 6 days after Envoy Dossett's arrest, these projections were reclassified as restricted intelligence by the Conclave Security Directorate. The reclassification was backdated to make it appear that the documents had always been restricted. The original classification stamps were altered in the Conclave's archival records. Marin brought up a third display, a side-by-side comparison. On the left, the original header from the Confederacy's relay station transit logs, showing the internal distribution classification. On the right, the altered header from the Conclave's own records, showing restricted intelligence with the same date. The relay station transit logs are maintained by the Terran Confederacy's Signals Office and cannot be accessed or modified by any Conclave system. They preserve the original classification headers of every message that passed through the diplomatic relay. These headers do not match the Conclave's current records. The discrepancy is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of arithmetic. Jurist Devan Orath's hand moved to his console, an involuntary motion, as if he was reaching for something to steady himself. He caught himself and folded his hands in his lap instead, but not before the gallery saw. Not before 300 observers registered that a sitting jurist's autonomic response had betrayed what his training could not contain. At the prosecution table, Torek Shal was reading the side-by-side comparison with the concentration of a man reviewing the foundation of a building he had spent 11 days constructing. His assistants had stopped moving. One of them, a young Asthari with narrow cranial ridges and the tight jaw of someone whose career had just been complicated, was staring at the prosecution's own case files as if seeing them for the first time. Because he was. He was seeing the reclassified headers in his files and comparing them to the original headers on the display, and the discrepancy was not subtle. It was not a matter of interpretation. It was 2 different words where the same word should have been. "I have a 4th document," Marin said. "A personnel communication from the Conclave Security Directorate to the Judicial Secretariat, dated 2 days before Envoy Dossett's arrest. It instructs the Secretariat to prepare a case file for a proceeding that had not yet been authorized by any judicial body. The communication references charges that had not yet been formulated and names a defendant who had not yet been accused." The document appeared on the display. The gallery had gone completely still. "And a 5th, Marin said. She brought up the next file. It was an Internal Security Directorate memorandum, a personnel action order, reassigning Deputy Trade Minister Ashiv Karath to a remote border posting 48 hours after Dossett's arrest. Deputy Trade Minister Karath was the conclave official who shared the internal distribution projections with Envoy Dossett. He is the only person, besides Envoy Dossett himself, who can testify to the original classification of those documents. 2 days after Envoy Dossett's arrest, Karath was reassigned to monitoring station Verath 9, 3 relay jumps from the nearest tribunal jurisdiction. The reassignment order was issued by the Security Directorate, the same body that retroactively reclassified the documents and prepared the case file before the arrest was made. She let that sit. Let the gallery trace the line, the directorate that changed the stamps, that built the case file before the arrest, that removed the corroborating witness to a post beyond the reach of testimony. The directorate removed the one person who could contradict the fabricated classification. They did it before the trial began, before this panel was convened, before any of us walked into this chamber. Marin turned from the gallery to face the bench directly. Taken together, these 5 documents establish the following. The charges against Envoy Dossett were constructed before his arrest. The evidence supporting those charges was fabricated through retroactive reclassification. The one corroborating witness was removed from tribunal jurisdiction. The case file was prepared before the judicial system authorized a proceeding. And the verdict was written before the trial began, complete with a death sentence, signed by the presiding jurist 11 days ago, before hearing a single word of testimony. She paused. The daylight from the glass dome fell across the podium and across her face, and in that light, under the gaze of 300 observers, she delivered the next words with the controlled weight of someone who had spent 14 weeks and 6 sleepless hours preparing for this exact moment. Archon saveth null. Under Conclave Judicial Provision 12, I formally challenge the integrity of this proceeding. I move for immediate dismissal of all charges, release of Envoy Dossett, and referral of the pre-signed sentencing document and all related evidence to the Conclave's Judicial Oversight Committee for investigation. Saveth Null's face was stone. Her copper eyes did not blink. The cranial ridges along her temples had drawn tight, a stress response that Marin had learned to recognize in 11 days of watching this woman deny motion after motion with the practiced ease of someone who already knew how the story ended. The Archon's voice when she spoke was ice-cold and absolutely steady. Counselor Aldrich, the documents you have presented were not disclosed during the evidentiary phase. Provision 12 requires that challenge evidence be obtained through lawful means. How did you obtain the sentencing document? Through a source I am not required to identify under Provision 12, which explicitly protects the anonymity of judicial integrity witnesses. The provision was drafted with this exact scenario in mind, a scenario in which the misconduct originates from the bench itself, and in which identifying the source would subject them to retaliation by the very authority under challenge. Saveth Null's fingers unlinked. It was the first time Marin had seen her hands move independently during a session. I will recess this proceeding to examine. No. The word landed like a hammer strike on stone. The gallery drew a collective breath. Marin had not raised her voice. The word was flat, even, spoken at the same conversational volume she had used throughout. But the refusal of a defense advocate to accept a recess, directly, to the face of the presiding Archon of the Supreme Bench, was something that had no precedent in this chamber. In 73 years since the last Provision 12 invocation, no one had tested whether the provision's protections included the right to refuse a recess. Marin had spent 3 of her 6 preparation hours confirming that it did. I will not accept a recess, she said. A recess gives this bench time to suppress the documents I have just placed on the record. It gives the Security Directorate time to alter the transit log comparison. It gives the Judicial Secretariat time to modify the metadata on the pre-signed sentence. Every hour this proceeding is not in session is an hour during which the evidence of misconduct can be made to disappear, the same way the original classification stamps were made to disappear. The same way Deputy Trade Minister Carath was made to disappear. She held Saveth Null's gaze. This proceeding will continue. The challenge will be heard, and the panel will vote now in open session with 300 witnesses present and every document on the record. Saveth Null's jaw shifted, a micro-motion that in an Astari face signaled the recalibration of strategy. The bench will confer privately before. The bench will not confer privately, Marin said. Provision 12, Section 3, Clause 9. When the challenge names the presiding jurist as the subject of misconduct, no private conference between the named jurist and the remaining panel members shall occur prior to the integrity vote. The provision anticipates this exact maneuver, Archon. The drafters were thorough. In the gallery, several Asthari officials who had clearly never read the full text of Provision 12 were now consulting their personal devices, pulling up the provision's language, checking Marin's citation, discovering that the human defense attorney had a more precise command of Conclave judicial code than the body that had written it. The chamber held. Savith Nal's copper eyes burned, but the fire behind them was not anger. It was the cold recognition of a position that had no legal exit, because the provision she was being challenged under was a provision she had spent her career upholding as proof of the Conclave's commitment to judicial integrity, and refusing to apply it now would prove Marin's point more effectively than any document could. The defense has invoked Provision 12 and declined a recess, Savith Nal said, her voice controlled but stripped of its earlier authority. Under the provision's own terms, a challenge supported by documentary evidence requires a panel vote on whether the integrity threshold has been met. If 2 of 3 jurists find that the threshold is met, the proceeding is suspended and referred for investigation. She looked at Orath, then at Voss. Her copper eyes carried a message that Marin could read even across the distance of the chamber, a reminder of who had appointed them, who controlled their careers, who held the architecture of their professional lives in her elongated gray fingers. "The vote is called," Savith Nal said. Jurist Devan Orath voted first. His hand moved to his console panel, and for a moment it hovered, trembling visibly, which Marin noted because Asthari hands did not tremble unless the autonomic nervous system had overridden the cultural prohibition against visible distress. He was young for this bench, young enough that his career could survive being on the right side of this moment. Young enough that the alternative, voting to protect a pre-signed death sentence, would follow him through every appointment, every review, every whispered assessment of his judgment for the rest of his professional life. His panel lit green, integrity threshold met. Marin's gaze moved to jurist Kellam Voss. The older man sat very still. His heavy face was turned toward the holographic display where the 5 documents hung in pale cyan light: the pre-signed death sentence, the original classification headers, the altered headers, the premature case file instructions, the witness removal order. Each one a component of a construction that had been built to bury a man, now rearranged on the wall of a public chamber where 300 witnesses could read them. Voss looked at Savith Nal. The Archon's face gave him nothing, no signal, no promise, no threat. Whatever loyalty or obligation had bound him to that center chair for the length of his career, it could not compete with the 5 documents on the wall and the 300 pairs of eyes in the gallery, and the simple, immovable fact that the woman in the center chair had signed a death warrant before hearing testimony. His panel lit green. 2 of 3, threshold met. Archon Savith Nal's panel remained dark. She did not vote. Her vote was irrelevant. The provision required only a simple majority. "The integrity threshold is met," Orath said, reading from the procedural text on his console with the careful enunciation of a man who wanted the record to be very, very clear. "Proceeding 7714T is suspended. All charges against the defendant are held in abeyance pending the outcome of a judicial integrity investigation. The defendant is to be released from detention within 4 hours. The pre-signed sentencing document and all related evidence are to be preserved under seal and transferred to the Conclave's Judicial Oversight Committee." He paused. Then he added, reading from the next line of the provision: "The presiding jurist named in the challenge is recused from all further proceedings in this matter and any related matter, effective immediately." Savith Nal sat in her center chair and did not move. Her hands were flat on the bench. Her face held its composure the way a dam holds water through engineering, not nature. Around her, the gallery erupted into the sharp, controlled murmur of 300 individuals, simultaneously processing the fact that the highest judicial authority in 411 systems had just been recused from her own bench by her own provision. In the gallery, the Thessari trade envoy was already on his personal relay. Marin could see the device's faint amber glow reflected in the polished stone of the seatback in front of him. Whatever he was transmitting would reach his government within the hour. The Thessari had 4 active trade agreements with the Conclave, and every one of them rested on the assumption that Conclave judicial proceedings were conducted honestly. That assumption had just been dismantled on a public display in front of a credentialed foreign observer. 2 rows behind the Thessari envoy, a group of Asthari judicial clerks, mid-level functionaries who had attended as part of their continuing education rotation, were exchanging the kind of glances that precede institutional reckoning. They had watched this trial as a training exercise. They had just learned something about their institution that their training had never prepared them for. Marin turned to the defense table. Dossett was looking at her. His expression was the one she had seen before on other clients in other proceedings, the expression of someone who had accepted the worst and then watched the floor fall out from beneath the people who had built it. She walked back to the table and sat down beside him. 4 hours, she said quietly, then you walk out. What about the investigation? The oversight committee will take months, but the evidence is on the record. 300 people just watched it go up on the display. The Thessari envoy is already transmitting to his government. I saw his hand move to his personal relay before Oreth finished reading the provision. The Kethani observer has been recording since I put up the first document. By tomorrow, every allied state in the Conclave's network will know what happened in this chamber. And saveth Nal. She signed a death sentence before the trial started. That's not a career-ending document. That's a civilization-defining one. The Conclave will have to decide whether their highest jurist ordering an execution before hearing testimony is an aberration or a feature of how they do business. Dossett looked at the bench, where Saveth Nal still sat, motionless, as the associate jurists conferred in low voices and the gallery's murmur filled the chamber. What happens to us? He asked. The Confederacy's relationship with the Conclave. That depends on what they do next. If they investigate honestly, if the Oversight Committee examines the reclassification, the pre-signed sentence, Karath's reassignment, the Security Directorate's premature instructions, then the relationship can be rebuilt. Institutions that find and correct their own corruption are institutions worth engaging. And if they don't, then the Confederacy will release the transit log comparison publicly. Every diplomatic partner the Conclave has will see the original classification headers beside the altered ones. Every allied state will know that the Conclave fabricated evidence to execute a diplomatic envoy. And every species currently operating under a trade agreement with this body will ask itself whether the documents it signed were honest. She paused. That's not a threat. That's a description of what happens when trust is withdrawn. The bench chime sounded. Jurist Oreth, now the acting presiding jurist, called the chamber to order one final time. This proceeding is suspended. The defendant will be released to his delegation's custody. The Judicial Oversight Committee is hereby activated under Provision 12, Section 4. All parties are ordered to preserve relevant records. He struck the chime. The session ended. Marin remained seated. She watched the holographic display cycle through the standard post-session archive sequence. Each document flagged, time-stamped with the session's official record number and committed to the Conclave's permanent judicial archive. Once committed, they could not be deleted. They could not be altered. They could not be reclassified. The Conclave's archival system had been designed by its founders to be tamper-proof, specifically to prevent the kind of retroactive manipulation that the Security Directorate had performed on the trade corridor projections. The irony was clean and precise. The same system that could not protect Dossett's evidence from being reclassified before trial could now protect the evidence of that reclassification from being buried after it. The gallery emptied slowly. Asthari officials moved in clusters, speaking in the careful, modulated voices of people who knew they were being observed and who were rapidly recalculating which side of the coming investigation they needed to be on. The prosecution team packed their materials in silence. Torek Shao paused at the door, looked back at the holographic wall where the documents had hung, and then left without a word. The posture of a man who had spent 11 days building a case he now understood had been handed to him pre-assembled, its conclusions written before its evidence existed. Savith Nal rose from her chair. She was the last jurist to leave the bench. She descended the steps with the rigid posture of someone who would not allow her body to betray what her face would not show. At the base of the steps, she stopped. She turned her head not toward Marin, but toward the display wall, where the 5 documents still glowed in pale cyan light against the dark stone. She looked at them the way someone looks at a mirror that has shown them something they cannot unsee. Then she walked out through the jurist's private exit, and the door closed behind her. Marin sat at the defense table while the chamber emptied. Dossett had been escorted back to detention by Conclave security, not roughly, not gently, with the cautious efficiency of guards who had watched their highest authority get recused in public and were recalibrating their understanding of who deserved what kind of handling. The chamber was nearly empty when the woman from the back row of the gallery approached. She was human, late 30s, dark hair, wearing a plain dark coat that Marin recognized as Confederacy Diplomatic Service, standard issue, no insignia, the kind of coat that said I am here in an official capacity, but I am not making a show of it. Counselor Aldrich. Yes. Commander Lies Heron, Confederacy Naval Intelligence. I've been observing the trial on behalf of the Joint Chiefs. Marin nodded. She had suspected military observation. The Confederacy did not send a senior defense attorney 14 weeks through relay space without having someone in the gallery keeping count. The Joint Chiefs have a message for you, Heron said. Not a formal communication, an observation. Go ahead. Heron glanced at the empty bench, then back at Marin. 12 hours before you invoked Provision 12, the Confederacy's Third Fleet completed a repositioning exercise. 41 vessels, including 7 capital ships, moved from their standard patrol stations in the Thessari buffer zone to holding positions along the Conclave's outer boundary. Marin's face did not change. The repositioning was logged as a routine readiness drill, Heron continued. It was conducted on an open channel. Every Conclave monitoring station along the boundary registered the fleet's presence. And 4 hours ago, approximately 90 minutes after you put the pre-signed sentence on the display, the Conclave's military liaison transmitted a priority query to our embassy asking whether the fleet repositioning was connected to the trial. What was the response? The embassy acknowledged receipt of the query. It did not answer the question. Marin understood. The fleet had not been sent because of the trial, or perhaps it had. The distinction was irrelevant. What mattered was that the Conclave knew it was there, and the Conclave did not know why, and the Conclave's highest jurist had just been caught signing a death sentence for a Confederacy diplomat before the trial started, and 41 warships were sitting on the boundary in formation, silent, transmitting nothing, just present. She thought about the Conclave's military liaison, sitting in whatever operations center monitored the boundary, reading the fleet's transponder data and trying to determine intent from formation geometry. 7 capital ships, 34 escort and support vessels. Enough firepower to reduce the Conclave's border stations to expanding vapor, and positioned precisely at the edge of sovereign space, where their presence was legal, visible, and entirely ambiguous. Not a blockade, not an encirclement, a readiness drill. The kind of drill that a careful government schedules when one of its diplomats is on trial for fabricated charges in a foreign judiciary, and the trial's presiding jurist has already signed the death warrant. The silence said everything, the fleet said nothing, and that was the point. "The Joint Chiefs want you to know," Harron said, "that the fleet will remain in position until Envoy Dossett is released and confirmed safe aboard a Confederacy vessel." "That's not necessary. The provision mandates release within 4 hours." "The fleet will remain in position," Harron repeated. The tone was not argumentative. It was the voice of an institution that had learned to prepare for the difference between what a provision mandated and what a compromised judiciary might actually do. Marin looked at her for a moment, then she nodded. "Counselor," Harron said, "one more thing." "Yes." "The Joint Chiefs asked me to tell you, and this is a direct quote, the law was enough, but the fleet makes sure nobody forgets it." She inclined her head slightly and left the chamber. Marin sat alone at the defense table. The holographic display had cycled to standby. The 5 documents were gone, replaced by the neutral amber glow of the Conclave's judicial idol screen. The glass dome overhead showed the station's artificial sky, bright and even, the same calibrated daylight that had illuminated every session of the trial, every denied motion, every fabricated exhibit, every moment of a performance whose script had been written before the curtain rose. She thought about Loreth Koo, the 31-year bureaucrat who had stood in a maintenance corridor and handed her a data chip because he believed the law was supposed to mean what it said. She would never be able to thank him publicly. His name would never appear in any record. But the chip he had placed in her hand had stopped a death sentence, recused an archon, and cracked open a system that had operated behind sealed doors for longer than most of its members had been alive. She thought about Saveth Nall at the base of the bench steps, looking at the documents on the display. The mirror she could not unsee. Somewhere in this station, the archon was sitting in her private chambers, and the realization settling over her was not that she had been caught, but that the provision she had presided over for decades had functioned exactly as designed, and she was the reason it had needed to. She thought about Tobias Dossett, who would walk out of detention in less than 3 hours and board a Confederacy vessel. 9 years of relationships, with trade officials, with border station managers, with the junior clerks and protocol officers who kept the Conclave's vast bureaucracy running. All of it nearly erased by a 3-page construction and a pre-signed death warrant. All of it still intact, because one bureaucrat in a maintenance corridor had decided that 31 years of service meant something, and because one defense attorney had spent 14 weeks in transit preparing for a proceeding she had suspected, from the moment she read the case file, was designed to end before it began. She thought about the fleet on the boundary, 41 ships holding position in silence, the way a fact is present, the way a consequence is present, not a threat, never a threat, just the quiet geometry of a civilization that prepared for every outcome and hoped for the better ones. Marin collected her data slate and stood. She straightened her jacket, the same dark-fitted jacket she had worn every day, no insignia, no decoration, no rank. 22 years of interstellar law, 7 sovereignties, dozens of cases won and lost. None of them had felt like this one. None of them had carried the weight of a death sentence pre-signed by the presiding jurist, of a fleet holding position on the boundary, of a government's trust delivered in 3 sentences at 4 in the morning. None of them had rested on a data chip passed in a maintenance corridor by a bureaucrat who had decided that 31 years of institutional obedience was not worth more than 1 act of institutional conscience. She walked toward the chamber exit. She stopped in the doorway and looked back at the chamber one last time. The bench where a death sentence had been pre-signed. The podium where she had said the word that had no precedent, that single syllable, delivered without heat, without volume, without emphasis, that had cracked open 73 years of uncontested judicial authority. The defense table where a man had sat for 11 days, trusting that the person beside him would find the seam in the wall they had built around him. Somewhere in this station, Torek Shal was sitting with his prosecution files, reading through the case he had spent 11 days presenting, and understanding, perhaps for the first time, that his case had been assembled before he received it. That the charges, the evidence, the witness list, the procedural framework, all of it had been handed to him the way a stage manager hands a script to an actor. He had delivered his lines with skill and conviction, and none of it had been real. Marin did not feel sorry for him. He was a prosecutor. It was his job to verify the evidence he presented. But she recognized the weight of what he was now carrying. The knowledge that his professional reputation had been used as a vehicle for someone else's construction. The chamber was quiet, the dome let in its even light. Marin turned and walked into the plaza. Behind her, in the restricted queue of the Judicial Secretariat's archival system, a pre-signed death sentence sat under seal, time-stamped, authenticated, and permanent. It would be read by the Oversight Committee. It would be read by every allied state that had observers in the gallery. It would be read by every species that had ever trusted the Conclave's judiciary to function as something other than an instrument of the powerful. The sentence had been written to end one man's life. It had ended something else entirely.